Hey everyone, I hope you are having a wonderful day so far. I am just dropping this special little clip into all the episodes. So, no matter what episode you're listening to, this is actually pretty current as of July 2024. I wanted to come on here and just say a big thank you to Earworthy because the Life Shift podcast was just named the best overall podcast of the year in the first Earworthy Independent Podcast Awards. And you've probably seen some articles written about the Life Shift podcast before, written by Earworthy. And now he is launching from his online publication, he is launching these yearly winners of independent podcast awards. And these are specifically for indie podcasters. We are those that wear all the hats. We create the show. Some people write the show. We're producers, sound engineers. We troubleshoot all the tech. We do any kind of research if we need to. We host the shows. We distribute the shows. We do all the things that relate to our shows because we love it. And it's so nice to see my name in a list with some other amazing podcasts like Multispective, which won Best Life Lessons Podcast. Salad with a Side of Fries won Best Health Podcast. Bippity Boppity Business won Best Business Advice Podcast. And there are so many more. And so I just want to come on here and say thank you to Earworthy for not only doing these awards every year and just honoring some of us indie podcasters that sometimes feel like we're just shouting into the void, but we're not. We're just doing what brings us joy, and hopefully through that work it brings other people joy. In my case, for the Life Shift, I hope that each episode finds the ears that needed to hear it the most so that they feel a little less alone in their circumstance. But also, Earworthy writes all these amazing publications pretty much weekly, every week, every weekday, I should say, where he writes on Blogger, Medium, Substack, Tumblr, Vocal, Many Stories, and for other places. And he really just highlights the independent podcasters. So thank you, Frank, for everything you do with Earworthy and for recognizing all of us in the first Earworthy Independent Podcast Awards. If you'd like to read more, please head to medium.com/EAR hyphen WORTHY. Thanks again and enjoy this episode.
When my therapist sees these two events and she's just like, for her, a big red flag waves, and she's like, do you understand the connection between these two events? I was like, well, I guess it's my parents struggled to help me navigate my emotions. And so as we dug into this, what we've discovered is that my parents, I mean, they stayed married. They were always married. They were always there. They went to almost every basketball game I ever played. Right? They were there for me physically, but what I discovered is they were not there for me emotionally. And for me, so 2 years ago, I would have been 37. I'm starting this therapy process. And right now at 37, it hits me as all during my upbringing, I was emotionally neglected.
In this episode, I'm joined by Ryan Gottfredson, an author, researcher, and consultant in leadership development. Ryan talks about his journey to figuring out his relationship with his parents, his emotional issues, and how therapy can help us rewire our brains to work better. He also dives into how getting to the bottom of trauma through therapy is crucial to the healing process. And we talk a little bit about the advantages of EMDR, which a few of my other guests have talked about too. But for me, it's still so interesting to learn a little bit more about. Join us as we chat about the importance of emotional healing and trauma understanding, and how Ryan's life changing moment opened up a world of more emotional clarity. But before we start the episode, I again want to thank my Patreon supporters. So thank you once again to Tracy, Emily, and Mickey for sponsoring 2 episodes a month. This is so helpful to cover the production costs. And just last month, Dream Vacations became a sponsor of the show. A few friends of mine own this travel agency, and I get to see these amazing cruises and the trips that they go on for research and the deals that they find for their clients. So if you're itching for some travel in 2023, please reach out to Trapper and Shane at the link in the show notes, or you can follow them at your vacation heroes on Instagram and Facebook. And if you're interested in joining the Patreon, please head over to www.thelifeshiftpodcast.com/join. And without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Ryan Gottfredson. I'm Matt Gilhooly, and this is The Life Shift, candid conversations about the pivotal moments that have changed lives forever. Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Life Shift podcast. I am here with Ryan, and we are connected through another podcast that we both were on called The Eternal Optimist. It's nice to have you here, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I am looking forward to our conversation today because, just so the listeners know, I don't know which direction you're going to go, so you're going to surprise me, and I think that's it's fun for me because I like to have these conversations as candid as possible. When I have guests fill out this short little form, I really only ask you guys just a simple question, like just tell me the littlest amount of detail, just so I can understand kind of where we're going to go and prepare myself. So I'm excited to have this conversation today. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, and like I just said to you before we started, is thanks for creating the space. Thanks for having me on. Hopefully, we could talk about a few things that might be beneficial to some of your listeners.
Why don't we just get into it? So typically I like to have my guests kind of paint the picture of life or what life was like before we hit that life shift pivotal moment. And then we can kind of just pick apart that's those specific moments if there's one or two. But just give us kind of a who you were and what you were doing and what brought you to that first moment.
To just help people get to know me just a little bit better. So, I'm a leadership professor at Cal State Fullerton. And in my research, I focus on personal and particularly leadership development. And so, I have been a huge studier of essentially all my adult life of how do we get better? How do we move to a better place? Here's the reason why is because so much out there on personal improvement focuses on the doings. Here are the things that you need to do. And I like that. That's good. But to me, that seems surface. It seems shallow because I believe that development is about becoming, not doing. And so, as I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey, and I imagine you see this, maybe not necessarily articulated in this way, but I'm sure that you see this with all of your guests, is the moments that they talk about represent a shift in their being. And to me, everybody goes through challenging things, right? Everybody has bad things that happen to them or life-changing moments, but not everybody capitalizes on those in terms of changing their being. And I would say there's some things in my life that I've experienced that didn't change my being, but kind of the moment that I want to talk about is leading up to this is, of course, life's not linear, and to a certain extent, life was pretty good, right? So I'm got a stable job, I got a family, I got my wife, my two kids. And while there was some disruption in terms of the quality of my relationship with my wife, and I wanted to improve that, I think maybe that was a way that opened the door. But in my academic research, what I was doing is I was deepening my study of this, how do we improve our being? And I came across a book, and I'm curious if you've heard of it. It's called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk.
I have heard of it. I have not read it. My guest, actually, episode 4, she highly recommended that, and it's actually why she somewhat became a biohacker in a way of her own body, and she used that book along with other studies to basically cure her chronic PTSD. Through kind of that. So I have heard about it, and other listeners have said, I heard Adrian talk about that, and I bought the book immediately and did the work. So yes, I've heard about it, but I haven't read it. Full disclosure.
Which is for those who haven't heard of it or haven't read it, it is a book about trauma and how psychological trauma impacts our body and our minds and how these things function. And it is approachable. It is dense in terms of, wow, there's a lot of good stuff. Like, I'm not sure there's a book that I've underlined more than that book. And what was interesting is I'm reading this book and it's all making sense to me. Okay, somebody who experiences psychological trauma, they have different body adaptations. Oftentimes that's most primarily in our body's nervous system. And I'm reading this, okay, this makes sense. But also at the same time while I'm reading this, what I'm thinking to myself is I don't have any trauma. And I get to the end of the book, and towards the end of the book, he walks through the research behind different therapy modalities. And he comes across a therapy modality that's called EMDR. It's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And he starts to present some of the research findings on this. And he said, admittedly said, this is a rather new form of therapy. And so there's not a ton of research out there, but the research that exists suggests that it may be the most effective therapy for helping people overcome the effects that psychological trauma has had on their bodies. And so I read this and I'm thinking like EMDR, the first initial stages of the development of EMDR was like somebody holding their finger up in front of you and moving it side to side. And then the eye movements, for whatever reason, soften our inhibitions so that we are more able to step into past traumatic experiences and reprocess them more effectively. And so as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, this sounds a little hocus pocus to me. Like moving your finger back and forth. Later come to learn that it's not, they usually don't do a finger back and forth. They do taps on your shoulders, or they'll have buzzers in your hands. Sometimes they do a dot across the screen, or I'll tell you a little, I jumped into this, or they do pings across your ears. And for whatever reason, and science doesn't really know, that these bilateral movements allow somebody to step in and more effectively reprocess past trauma. So I'm reading this and I'm thinking, man, this sounds hocus pocus, but also really cool. I wonder if I could just try it out and just experience it, see what it's like. And so I reached out, I just hopped on Google, EMDR therapist near me, and a hit pops up. And so I reach out to her and said, and literally in my email, and I'm sure she gets this all the time, like, I don't really have any trauma, but I would love to experience EMDR. Do you think it could benefit me even if I don't have trauma? And I'm sure she's thinking, this dude's got trauma, because at the time I wasn't aware, but now I know is 70% or more of all adults have experienced trauma to the degree that it disrupts their body's nervous system.
I would say it's more. I mean, based on just this podcast alone and having these conversations, I would say it's more, and that's okay.
Yeah. And that is okay, because at the end of the day, the connection, and I imagine we'll come back to this, is for me, and this is the most meaningful part of it, is if we want to improve our being, how we do that is actually through healing. It's healing our body, healing our body's nervous system from whatever has happened in the past. So I reach out to this trauma therapist, and she said, yeah, I think everybody's got mental blocks. This will help you work through any mental blocks. And I'm sure it'll help you professionally if that's something you want to do. I said, okay, let's do it. And so I started this process, and this was about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. I start doing this, and it does feel a little like hocus pocus. She's like, okay, now close your eyes. And I've got my headphones in, and these beeps are going back and forth. And how EMDR works is it usually starts out by saying, where's a place that you have a block in your life? And then let's do these little EMDR sessions where you actually just sit, you think about that block, you think about the feelings, you think about like your body, your emotions, and these pings are going back and forth in my ears. And all of a sudden, it's like you're stepping into a wormhole in a way. It's like you start diving into other stuff that are tangentially related. And over a series of about 3 or 4 sessions, we had dug from a recent kind of block or episode that I had that I was like, I just didn't love the way that I handled this. And we start diving down, and we get deeper and deeper. And we discovered through this process, for me, there were 2 significant moments in my childhood that are representative of a bigger issue that I was completely unaware of. So And maybe let me walk you through these two episodes. One of the episodes that came up through one of these sessions was a vivid memory, and it's always stuck with me, but there's a vivid memory when I was about 5 or 6 years old of my parents having this huge argument. Like they are yelling at each other. There's no hitting, there's no physical violence. And I remember my dad pulling out a suitcase and starting to pack it with his clothes, like he's going to leave. And I'm seeing this, like, I even as I tell you this, I know exactly where I'm at. I see this picture, and I am just hysterical. What is going on? Am I losing a parent? Like, I didn't fully appreciate it, but I knew that this was significant. And the thing that was interesting about this, as we dug into this memory, what I came to realize is it wasn't that argument that is really what had stuck with me. What had stuck with me is, while my parents did have this big episode, it was tumultuous for me. My parents never tried to comfort me after that experience. They kind of just went on living as though nothing had ever happened. Like, I'm a child, 5 years old, emotionally distraught, and they leave me alone. And I imagine they've got their own emotional needs that they're having to deal with, right? So that makes sense. So this comes up as a pretty significant episode that has shaped me. Another episode that popped up was similar in nature. I have a few half siblings that are a ways older than me, and when I was 10, my half sister, she had two children at the time, a 4-year old, and a 2-year old, and her husband, he had epileptic issues in the past, and he had a seizure while he was getting his son out of the car, and for whatever reason, they think maybe he hit his throat on the car door or something. He vomited during a seizure, and it got stuck in his throat, and he wasn't able to breathe and effectively suffocated to death. And at the time I was 10, my brother-in-law, I looked up to him like a brother. Like he was a brother to me. And I remember the day my parents came home and told me that he had died, he had passed away. And I remember being so incredibly sad. And I remember I pulled a blanket up over me. I'm sitting on the couch, and I remember crying for probably 2 hours on the couch. And my parents never came and tried to comfort me. When my therapist sees these two events, and she's just like, for her, a big red flag waves. And she's like, do you understand the connection between these two events? I was like, well, I guess it's my parents struggled to help me navigate my emotions. And so as we dug into this, what we've discovered is that my parents, I mean, they stayed married. They were always married. They were always there. They went to almost every basketball game I ever played. Right? They were there for me physically, but what I discovered is they were not there for me emotionally. And for me, so 2 years ago, I would have been 37. I'm starting this therapy process. And right now at 37, it hits me, as all during my upbringing, I was emotionally neglected. Like, I just read this book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. He's talking about two primary forms of abuse: physical abuse and emotional neglect. And all of the research suggests that emotional neglect is as bad, if not worse, in terms of its effects on somebody than physical abuse. And oh my goodness, like, that was just my upbringing. That was my norm. I just expect everybody kind of had an upbringing like that. I just was completely unaware that I had psychological trauma in my background. And that was just a huge awakening moment.
Were your parents in their, I totally understand the emotional neglect component. Were your parents the type of parents that would award things that you've done? Like, you did well in school, you won a basketball game. Was there a lot of that, like, cheering and affection, if you will, in that way? Like if you did something good, did you have any of that?
No, not really. Right. So I never remember my dad like congratulating me on a good basketball game.
It was complete neglect in any kind of good, bad, indifferent space, just
Yeah.
present.
Yeah.
And not necessarily bad, right? Not you it wasn't like a bad experience, you just didn't have that support on the emotional side.
Yeah. And another example, like I remember before I was 5, I remember wrestling with my dad and thinking that was fun. I never remember playing with my dad after the age of 5. To a certain degree, my mom was less inclined to play physically, but I remember playing like games with her, like board games and things like that. And I would say both of my parents are really good, nice people. Like people in the community really liked them, respected them. They were good people. They just didn't have the ability to emotionally support really another
Well,
person.
I mean, the body keeps the score, right? And so your parents are a product of whatever came before that and their parents and kind of unfortunately moves through it. I was thinking, as you were telling this story of kind of your the emotional neglect as a child, and earlier you were talking about how you did a lot of research into leadership and more about that becoming and developing as people. I wonder how attached those really were, right? In the sense that your subconscious of some sort was seeking that wholeness in some way, and how by helping someone else maybe that subconscious is kind of fulfilled in a way. Like I don't know if do you see connections in that?
Yeah, no, I think so. Yeah, and I think in a variety of different ways. So I do think I now am able to look back, and I do think I grew up playing, as I mentioned, playing basketball, and for me, I was very dedicated in practicing. I became a pretty good basketball player, and I now see. I think I sought to become a better basketball player so that I can get the recognition of others and probably, hopefully, my parents.
Yeah.
Even though I never necessarily got
And I
that.
thought that was kind of why I was asking if your parents celebrated those more like check mark type things that other people could see, but if they didn't, it's a different story. I feel I did a lot of the same thing as well. I don't know that when my mom died, I was 8, and my dad was like a weekend father. He actually lived in Georgia, and I lived in Massachusetts at the time, so he was even less than a weekend father because he had to make money and do the thing, and it was the '80s, and I don't think he had the toolkit, of how to do it. And so when he was suddenly the only parent and had to navigate the world of a child that has just lost his parent, I can relate to. I think it was just like we don't talk about it and things will be fine, And it wasn't that he was doing this on purpose. And like to your point, your parents were good parents. It's just like sometimes they're just not equipped with it, and it was probably a product of the time period as well, in a sense
Yeah, I
that
think so. Yep.
because we're around the same age, and growing up, it was very much that boys shouldn't, do X, Y, and Z. Boys shouldn't cry because that's a more feminine quality, and you shouldn't have that. But nowadays, like we're more aware that men are full human beings and women are full human beings, and anyone on any spectrum are full human beings and they can do whatever they want. But very much relate to not having that emotional support. And so I sought out, like, I became a good student when my mom died. Before that, I didn't care about school. A C was a-okay for me, but after my mom died, an A plus was always needed because two things.
Yeah.
I wanted the approval, right? Kind of in that sense of like,
Yep.
but my dad would give me the approval, at least in those areas. Like that would be like, yay, good for you. But I also wanted to prove to others I wasn't worthy of any kind of neglect or loss. In my sense, it was I didn't want anyone else to leave. Like my mom left me, not on purpose, but in my mind, it was an empty spot. So I wasn't going to allow that to happen. So,
Yeah.
that's kind of where that stems from of like, did you get any check marks? But it sounds like they were just parents that were a product of the time period and their probably own upbringing as well.
Yep.
It's so
Yeah.
interesting though that a book, like your pivotal moment is really probably picking up that book. What made you get that book?
Yeah, yeah. So it was kind of more the research end of things. So one of my areas of expertise is mindsets, and one of the things that I've come to learn is that trauma, when somebody experiences trauma, the body's nervous system adapts in such a way that it is designed to self protect the individual from more trauma occurring, and that makes sense. And we develop self-protective mindsets, right? While self-protective mindsets are beneficial because they keep us safe, they actually hold us back from more of a professional component. Let me give you an example. One of the mindsets we can look at is the difference between a fixed and a growth mindset. I could ask people, how do most people think about or make meaning of failure? And I would say most people make meaning of failure as something to avoid because it's a signal about me. Maybe it says that I'm a failure. But that's people with a fixed mindset. People with a growth mindset, they don't see failure as an indication that they're a failure. They see failure as an opportunity to learn and grow. One of those responses, the fixed mindset response, is a self protective way of thinking about failure. The growth mindset is more of a value creating way of thinking about failure. And so, what I've learned is that when people experience trauma, their body's nervous system adapts to become more self protective, and they're more inclined to take on the negative mindsets. Here's what I love about what you said about kind of your journey is you were using words like, I wonder if this is like below your subconscious, like, and you're almost describing there's a void that's there that you're trying to fill and you may not be aware of it, right? And that's what's going on when we experience psychological trauma. It is controlling how our brain operates, and usually below the level of our consciousness. And while it might feel good and natural for us to fill a void, filling that void may be the very thing that holds us back
Mhm.
from the goals that we want to obtain or becoming the person that we want to become.
A lot of this for me, I think back to therapy in general, and the idea of therapy and when it works and when it doesn't work, in the sense that we have to have the awareness to be ready to accept that, and finding that, like, I'm sure in your research you found where someone can't, like, what is that spot in between that shifts someone from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. When you were describing it was very much that when someone's ready for therapy or when someone's ready to do the next step. Like, have you found what can trigger the change in your research? Not to go all academic here, but curious.
No, yeah. So there's two ways to think about it, but I think the best way to categorize this is to say heat experiences. Heat experiences can be external to us. They can be an event that occurs to us, or it could be internal, that we create the heat experience internal to us. Now, the thing about heat experiences, if they're going to lead to growth and development, they need to be something that causes us to question our current kind of beliefs and outlook on life, and then investigate those and try out new thoughts, beliefs, and ideals. So, this is why I say a lot of people go through bad things, but they don't necessarily use it to question, to introspect and question kind of the way in which they've thought about their world and how they perceive and how they interpret the world around them. There are experiences where people can benefit just by having those experiences. It does cause them to question, they do evaluate, and they do try out different ways of viewing the world. In the work that I do with leaders and helping them develop, oftentimes we're not relying upon an external heat experience. So we're trying to foster an internal heat experience. And one of the ways that we do this is by helping them to awaken to the quality of their current mindsets. So, and we do this through a variety of different ways. I've got a mindset assessment. Anybody could take that on my website at ryangottfredson.com, or we'll just simply kind of talk through it. What mindsets do we have? Where do we exist along different mindset continuums in terms of being self-protective to being value creating? And through that experience and having a framework, it allows us to be more intentional about figuring out where am I currently at in terms of the quality of my mindsets, and where do I need to go to have better mindsets, and then how do I make that shift? And we could create different activities involved in doing that.
Do you think though that you still have to have awareness? Because I feel like the
Yes, yes. So
internal,
that's the key. Like, yeah, so it always starts with awareness.
yeah.
And an external event can help open somebody up to stepping into that awareness. Or we could create an event like an assessment that opens the door for them to step into that awareness. But I would definitely agree with you. Awareness is the first step. And it's really, I mean, that's half the battle, is getting somebody to step into that
I
door.
venture to say it's even more than half, because I think there are people, also there are people that have like a fake awareness, if you will, because it's more performative and it's less becoming or being. I think it's interesting to think about, mindset and and your journey, and like was there a heat moment, internal or external, that led you to be willing to take it beyond the academic research of that book, to be like hocus pocus, and I'm in for it? Because a lot of people are going to look at, a lot of people will look at like hypnotherapy, they'll look at things that they've never tried before, and they'll see them as quote unquote hocus pocus. But at some point, enough people have taken that leap, and maybe it's a heat experience of some sort in your case, to be like, you know what, this could be worth this try. Or like, because there's a lot of things that are like sound like mystical and magical and that we'll never try. So what was there something in your life that occurred that was like, okay, I'll call him up or her. I have never had trauma in my life, in your email.
Well, like, let me give you an example. I've got a distantly related family member that somebody was telling me about them, and there's a lot of things in their life that aren't going well. They were telling me the story because they thought I would find their reaction to a suggestion interesting. So they were apparently suggested, I think you should look into therapy. And this person said, nope, not doing it. Like, the only people that get therapy are like cuckoo nuts, and I'm not a cuckoo nut, right? Or whatever it is. To a certain degree, unfortunately, that's a stance of ignorance, right? And I had learned enough across the research that I've done to understand what therapy really is as it relates to psychological trauma and how it can be beneficial. And maybe it might be helpful, or maybe some listeners might find this interesting. When we dive into the neuroscience behind psychological trauma and its impact on our body, we find that our body, if we experience psychological trauma, will go through one of two neurological adaptations. And sometimes it's even both, to a certain degree, or at different times. So to help understand this, what we need to understand is there's three main networks in our mind that are responsible for interpreting our world and getting our body to navigate our world. These three networks are our salience network. This is home of our emotions. This is our limbic system. There's the default mode network, which is the non-conscious programming of our body. And then there's the central executive network, which is the conscious programming of our body. And what the research has found is that ideally, these three brain networks are going to work effectively together. And when they do, then we are effectively more emotionally intelligent. We could better get in touch with our own emotions and navigate those emotions, and we could better get in touch with the emotions of others and navigate those emotions. Well, when somebody experiences psychological trauma, one of the common adaptations is that our salience network, our emotional network, becomes overactive, and the default mode network cannot regulate that overactivity. In these cases, individuals become hyper vigilant. When somebody is hyper vigilant, commonly they'll struggle with anxiety. And when people are hypervigilant and have anxiety, they over prioritize their own emotions, probably even too much. And when they're over prioritizing their own emotions, they have a hard time prioritizing anybody else's emotions, right? Knowing my mom was hypervigilant. She was a very anxious person. So that led her to be more concerned about her emotions than my emotions. The other neurological adaptation is the opposite, where the default mode network becomes overactive and it overregulates the limbic system or the salience network, the emotions. In this instance, when this occurs, our bodies have a reduced capacity to get in touch with our emotions. It's like if you think about Spock from Star Trek, like that's an overregulated default mode network on those emotions, and the technical term for this is dissociation. And when I think about my dad was dissociated, right? He didn't have the ability. He was like an even kill. He was the Spock. He's an engineer. Like it was he didn't have the ability to connect with his emotions. And because he can't connect with his emotions, he can't connect with my emotions. And what I've come to learn through my therapy journey is that my adaptation is more like my dad's, where I experienced dissociation. And so the whole purpose of therapy is to help these different networks work more effectively together so that we don't have the negative effects of either dissociation or hypervigilance. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
it totally makes sense. I just it's it's still curious to me if someone, like you say, you kind of tend to, or you tended to go more towards the dissociation, like your father. Like, why would you do the ping pong in your ear? Like what made you do that? Like, I feel like I didn't get therapy for so long. And mine was interesting. My journey was so interesting for me because I look back on it and I used my mother's death as a crutch for any circumstance in my life. And I didn't realize it at the time, but it was like if something went bad in my life, that was my excuse. Well, my mom died when I was a kid, so therefore I couldn't do XYZ. If something good went, well, it was because my mom died that that good thing happened to me. And it took me like, I want to say like 20 years to really be ready to shed that, whatever that was. I can't even say it's a victim mentality because I was like using it to my my advantage as well. And so, like, but I can't pinpoint what triggered me to take that leap and make myself more vulnerable. But damn, if I'm glad, I'm so glad that I did that because of what it uncovered for me in my trauma. I mean, like my trauma looks very clear on the surface, but that wasn't what had ruined the 20 years after. Not ruined, but had really affected those 20 years. So I was just curious as to like why you would even go, or is it that more your researcher mind?
Here's what I've seen with people is there's some people it's kind of like they ramp up to that. And then there's other people where it's more of a stepping stone, like walking upstairs. Like it's you come to a hard place and it's like something has got to change. And like I think oftentimes we almost call it we can call it rock bottom given the circumstances. Like that's more of an abrupt change. And as you describe kind of years, it just feels like he kind of ramped up into it, and it was just like oh, that just kind of feels like the next logical step in my progression. Not like I have to do it.
There were some dark moments, but yeah.
Well, yeah. So, and that those will play a role. And I think what I would say as you say that there are some dark moments. The size of the heat experiences that you were having may not have been substantial, right? But they were significant at the same time. And I think that's the idea of the heat experiences, is they kind of put a crack in our facade to literally let the light in, right? And the problem is if a crack occurs, we're like, oh shit,
Mm-hmm.
I've got a crack. And and it's like, I've got to cover this up so that nobody sees my crack. And what we don't understand until we kind of pass through it, that crack let the light in.
Right.
And that was maybe the most beautiful thing that could have happened to me. And I think people who get on this journey that it sounds like we are on, it's kind of like when we talk to each other, it's like, I know that you know, and I think you know that I know. But there's a lot of people that we know, probably even family members, that it's like they don't know yet. They don't get it. They're not there yet. And I don't know, who knows if they'll ever get there.
I mean, it's interesting to me because I talk to so many people that have had seemingly similar levels of heat experiences, if we're going to use that term. And some of them, that same level, or what appeared on the surface to be the same level, triggered one to do one thing and triggered the other to do something completely different. And some in a more destructive manner and some in more positive manner. And it's so interesting that we as humans can experience something very similar and do so many different things with it when, and I'm going to just say this, and this is probably wrong, but in my mind, I always knew the way out growing up. Like, I always knew what I was supposed to do. And like, this is how I'm going to be better from losing my mother. But I never did it because I needed something, and I still haven't really uncovered what that was to get me to go to therapy, because I don't remember now, but I needed something that would snap me out of it to make me realize that maybe if I did that, it would come true. And maybe that's a fear of failure too, on that weird spectrum. But I don't know if you can relate to that.
Well, yeah, and there's a quote. I need to look it up that reminds me of what you said, and I don't know how to pronounce her name exactly right, but I think it's Anais Nin, and she said, "The day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom."
Yeah, I think that's my
And
story.
I think that that's kind of what we have to come to. Yeah,
Yeah. But to your point, there are a lot of people, and I always think the person that turns down therapy the hardest is probably the person that needs it the most,
most.
right?
Yeah, and that's also a signal of this dissociation that's there.
Through your therapy journey, how do you have a different feeling towards your parents before, after, during? Is there a different reconciliation, I guess, with how they treated you now that you have the tools of therapy in your pocket?
Yes. So, I mean, part of what I've learned is, in some ways, I really struggle with that dissociation thing, right? So, my therapist has told me multiple times. Normally, I see people get more angry at this than you, and it speaks to, I have I have a harder time building even emotions of anger, right? So, and so part of my therapy journey is to let more of these emotions in and figuring out ways to do so. So, but I would say, over the last 2 years since kind of this realization, I would say, so both of my parents have passed away. So they passed away about 10 years ago, both of them, both from cancer, at about a year separated from each other. So I haven't been able to talk to them about any of this. But I would say I do think that in a psychological way, I do feel like I still have a relationship with them. And I would say that my relationship over the last 2 years has definitely changed. And initially went like pretty far, I am cutting you off type thing. And that's where my therapist thought she would have seen more anger. But I'm just like, I mean, I think it would be different if they were alive, but I kind of cut them off. And I'm now kind of gotten to the point where I feel like my relationship with them is much more healthy. And what I am able to do is I'm able to say, I love my parents. They were good in some ways, but they were also terrible in other ways. And their influence has shaped me in both the positive and the negative. And I feel like I could simultaneously hold the good and the bad. And for me, that's okay. I would say I do anticipate my relationship with my parents to continue to change. But that's kind of where I feel I'm at now.
I mean, it makes sense to me. Part of me is also through this journey, I've learned, we're all flawed. And, when I did my episode, I didn't really tell my family that I was going to record my own personal episode until from my perspective. We've talked about it in pieces. And what I found is I was just honest and my dad listened to it. And we have a good relationship, now. We never had a bad relationship besides, like being just a jerk teenager kind of moment.
Yep.
Uh, but he listened to it, and what it gave me was the ability to have a conversation about it after the fact. And what I learned from that, and I think it also let me let go of some things, is that I truly believe at this point that he was doing the best he knew how to do with what he knew. And he was mid 30s, and it was suddenly his life had changed in the most drastic of ways. He had to say the hardest thing that he'll ever have to say to any person, when he sat me down and was like, your mom died, like, she's dead, she's never coming back, and I don't think I ever thought of those things. And so the reason I asked that question is because I can imagine that first moment when you're like, oh, you're right, I do have child trauma. Like, thank you, therapist, for really killing the mood today, and now I hate my parent. Like, I can imagine that, but I would imagine if I was in that situation, I would also wrestle with the fact that maybe they just didn't know. They just didn't know better, and they weren't doing it intentionally.
Yeah, you brought this up earlier because what I've also done over the last 2 years is try to get to know my parents better, right? So I tried to learn more about my dad's upbringing, and his dad was a very disconnected individual from emotion. Probably wasn't very supportive of him. I've learned that my mom was very likely physically abused and surely emotionally abused as a child. And on my mom's side, it goes back generations. I mean, there's some pretty horrific stories on my mom's side of the family that apparently have come out. So I know that my parents' environment shaped them, and that is something they didn't have control over. So I'm okay sitting with that. But also now I'm in a position where I have a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old, and part of why I want to continue my therapy journey is because I want to I want to try my best to break any cycle
Mhm.
that has been passed down. Right? I'm not going to be perfect. I mean, I've already seen some things with my children, but also at the same time, like with my 10-year-old daughter, we've got her into equine therapy as a way. She's got her own block. She's got and things like that. She's a really good girl, doing great in school. I just think, man, what if my parents would have had given me the opportunity to do equine therapy as a 10-year-old? I imagine I would have turned out a better person than what I was, and maybe where I am. I don't know. I feel like I had done a lot of development from the time I became effectively an adult up until the time I was 37. Like, I thought I'd done a lot of development. I felt like a very different person. In the last 2 years, I feel like I have grown more in the last 2 years through my therapy journey than all of that time before. I feel like I'm a very different person. I think my wife would, even if you asked her, she would say, "Yeah, he's a different person."
Yeah, and since we're in a very similar age group, I'll be 42 next month, and I talked to a lot of people about this that are kind of in our age bracket, that it sounds like a lot of the things that you accomplished before 37 were very much that societal checklist that didn't actually exist, but it was, you have to
Yep.
do this, and then this comes next, and this equates to success in whatever, whoever made that up, that we all subscribe to. But it sounds like that. And then when you were able to crack open the more human experience, it's really shaped your world in a much more rich way, would you say?
Yeah, I like the way you articulate, right? So some of the words that you said is it cracked open, right? We've already talked a little bit about that, and the human experience, and to me that's maybe been the biggest shift for me is
You feel more things now than you did before, I'm assuming, now that you are aware of that dissociation.
yes, for sure, and it, you can't articulate like if you haven't been through it, it's really hard to articulate the difference. It's like going from like I the way that I would say it, it's like I was living in a two-dimensional world and now it feels like I live in a three-dimensional world.
Yeah, it's like when Dorothy opened the door and she walked into Oz and everything was in color, like you're kind of
Yeah.
I it took me I had little breaks along the way, and like from 8 years old to 16 was just I remember nothing about any portion of grieving. And at 16 I was assigned an assignment in like a writing class of some sort, and I wrote about it, and I had my first like major breakdown. And I feel like that was like that first crack that we talked about earlier. Like I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't have anyone around me that knew how to do anything with it. Therapy wasn't a thing. It was like the 90s, and that just wasn't what you do as a teenager. But, that you can't describe it because you unless you go through it, right? You just don't know like what that pre-version of you was like. I was going to ask, and you kind of hinted at it, about how this version of Ryan, how you've noticed changes in your parenting. Like do you have notable changes to like how you approach things, or is it more just kind of organic?
Yeah, I think the easiest way kind of difference that it's made is one is I started as a father different than where my dad started. Right, I was almost the opposite of my dad because I didn't get much from my dad. So I always knew that I wanted to give to my kids. So I've been very involved in my kids' lives, but I will say more from a physical standpoint than from an emotional standpoint.
Okay.
Right. So I I used to be more of like they're hurt or they're crying, rub dirt on it, toughen up, and now I'm just slower to get there. I'm slower. I'm more. I create greater space for them to just share their emotions and let them have their emotions. I'm not going to try to force them away from their big or their strong emotions, but I will be there with them. I do a better job of being there with them in those emotions. Sure, I do think I could still do better in that regard. So I think that's probably the biggest shift there. I think there's other ways, but that's the biggest shift.
So here's a question that just came up in my head. You mentioned that your parents passed away about 10 years ago or so, and that was a different version of you at the time when your parents passed. Do you think that how did you react to their passing? Was it more a dissociated version of you than it would be, say, if they passed now? And you don't have to answer that if you don't want to.
Yeah, well, it was no, it was very dissociated. You know, I'm a pretty logical person, and I kind of saw the logic in it, right? So, cancer sucks, but there is one benefit of cancer for the loved ones of the people experiencing cancer, and that is you kind of know when they're going to go, and you have time to prepare. At least I did with my parents. So that I think that helped. But what I would say kind of is the response is, "Oh, I'm so sorry you lost your mom." And I'm like, "Yeah, I am too, but her being gone is better than the condition that she was in. She was miserable. Like I just hated seeing her, and I think she's in a better place. Like that's me logically talking through this, and so I didn't do a great job of the grieving. I don't even know if I still have, to be honest with you. But I think if it were to happen now, I think I would now, I mean, partly because of my greater tolerance for therapy, if you will, is I'd probably have someone help me walk through the grieving process. knowing that I'm not good on it on my own.
Yeah, I asked that again. Here, all my questions are apparently are selfish, and we're just doing therapy right now. But my mom died suddenly, and I didn't do a good job at grief. I was terrible at it. Like everything you could do wrong, I think, in my mind. Not that there's a right way to do it, but 20 plus years of it. And then in that time, my grandmother became basically my mom figure in my life, and we were very, very close. And then she got cancer. And so I knew, like you said, you know that there is a timeline now. You know that there is a more definitive one, not necessarily, but and I did everything right in my mind. I felt like I started the grief process before she died. I had the conversations, the ones that are typically in the eulogy. We sat down face to face and we were like, these are all the things I want to say to you right now. These are all the things you've changed in my life. These are all the things that I would want to say, at a eulogy, but I'm going to say it now. And when she died, I took some time off of work and I just did it. And then it was done. And then I felt like a completely different person. And so it's very, very weird to have that experience in which you can experience both and be and realize how much you failed the first time, or maybe I didn't. Maybe that was my learning process. But then to come into something else and be so weirdly good at it was just a very interesting experience. So that's kind of why I was curious
Yeah,
of,
interesting.
kind of
Yeah.
how, because I had no tools, and maybe because you hadn't gone through therapy yet, when your parents died, you didn't really have those tools either. It's just interesting to think about. Anyway, I'm so interested in this. What is it? EMDR?
EMDR. Yep. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Do you still do it?
I do, yeah. So, and we've kind of got to the point where we do it when there's
A
something
blockage.
clear to work on. Or, yeah, we uncover a block. So, like I had therapy yesterday, and we uncovered a block and kind of dove into it. And every time I do it, I walk away like that. I got a huge insight here. All right. So, one of the things that has come out, here's my insight from yesterday. One of the things that came out of my childhood is I learned at a very young age, if I want my emotional needs met, I need to meet them myself. Right. So I became a very independent person at a very young age. I'm still that way. I'm an incredibly independent person that has some really great things about it. It has some really bad things about it. Right. And one of the bad things about it, as I'm married to my wife, is it's really hard to be independent and like in tandem with somebody else, right? It's almost like two batteries at times are kind of pushing against each other, or two magnets are pushing against each other. But one of the things that as we stepped into this, where's this need for independence come from? And for whatever reason, what I discovered, it's I never want to feel trapped. Like, so there's something there about being trapped for me, and I need to stay free. And that is shaped at a non-conscious level the career that I have today. Like, I'm a professor and I'm a consultant. I don't have a boss, right? I could do whatever, I could research whatever I want, I could teach whatever I want, I can consult whatever I want. Like, I don't have anybody telling me what to do. And that's partly because of this non-conscious processing that I have to just not want to feel trapped. Where we're going to start to go in our therapy in the next several weeks is let's even dive into where does this fear of feeling trapped or tied down or restrained come from? There's something there that needs to be investigated and
It
healed.
keeps you forever curious. It's so interesting, all the different modalities of therapy and the things that can work for people in different ways. I would imagine that it doesn't work for everyone. I would imagine that, they're blocked in a way that doesn't allow them to do what they need to do, and maybe something else works. What I love coming away from these conversations with is that how important a focus on mental health and therapy, and how it needs to be more normalized in the sense that, like, we can't figure it all out ourselves. Like, there are other people that can see things that we can't see. And that's why, like, I love having these conversations too, because someone may be listening that is just doesn't realize that they were emotionally neglected as a child, that doesn't realize that there are these options. There's this book, like, who knows. I appreciate you sharing that story. I know it can be hard to share that with who knows who, but I think that's it's very valuable. So I appreciate it.
For sure. And I think as we think about what are some other ideas that might be valuable for listeners, and let me share this because to your point is not every therapy modality is going to work for everybody. And there's a variety of things that affect that, like the therapist, the context in which therapy occurs, etc. But I do think it's helpful to recognize that there are different therapy modalities. And in fact, we could group therapy modalities into two different types. So there are what is called top down therapy modalities. These types of therapies are the ones where we start in our cognitions, we dive down into our emotions, and then into the feelings in our body. Like, so cognitive behavioral therapy is just that. We start in cognition, we dive into emotions, and then into feelings. Top down therapies can be very beneficial. There are also bottom up therapies where we start in our feelings, we move into emotions, and then into cognitions. EMDR falls into the bottom up category. There's another form of therapy, but my therapist uses in tandem with EMDR, and it's called internal family systems therapy that I've also found really helpful. That's another bottom up approach. My belief is that both approaches simultaneously is best. But what research is indicating is that the bottom up approaches are more effective than the top down approaches. They're more effective at the rewiring in our mind that needs to occur for our brain to function in a more healthy manner. So, making that distinction might be helpful for some
Yeah,
people.
I mean, it also goes along with the line that the first therapist that you try might not be the therapist for you, and that you want to be okay. It's kind of like that what you were talking about earlier, that people like avoiding failure. Like just because a therapist doesn't work for you doesn't mean that therapy doesn't work for you. And so it's definitely worth anyone has tried it once and they're like, that's not for me. Try again. Try someone different. It took me 5 people to find the one that unlocked the thing that really made sense for everything. And when I talked to her and she told me that all the decisions that I made for up to like 30 something years old were by the 8-year-old kid in me, everything like unveiled itself. And I was like, holy, like, why couldn't you have told me this 20 years ago? But, I needed to go through that journey. And so I think it's important that people find the thing and the person that works best for them. I like to end these conversations with kind of a question. And I don't think it's fair to ask you my normal question. My normal question is if you could go back to that younger version of Ryan who's like hiding under that blanket, is there anything you could say to him? I don't know if you would. Is there anything you could say to him that would help you?
What has been helpful, I think, for me is, and this has been part of the EMDR process, is stepping into and uncovering what I've found is I've got a baby Ryan within me that I do a great job of keeping covered, keeping protective, and part of therapy is connecting with that kind of baby Ryan, if you will, or younger version of me. But one of the things that I actually try to do, and I'm fairly conscientious about this, is I try to hang out with the 5-year-old version of myself and the 10-year-old version of myself. Like, I live in Southern California. I love going to the beach. I actually try to go to the beach by myself every once in a while because I'm bringing 5-year-old me and 10-year-old me, and we're hanging out. I'm spending time with them in a way my dad didn't spend time with me. How helpful that has been. I'm not sure. I'd like to think it's been helpful, but it's a different way of thinking about it and giving myself, I think, some love that I probably need.
I mean, I think that's great. I think I can see that it moves you in a way that is appropriate, and maybe the five years ago version of you wouldn't have had those thoughts and those. Why would I do that? I think there's value in that. I think there's value in that whole where they have you write something like with your left hand or your opposite hand and think in that mindset. There's something to all these modalities and these different approaches that find the one that works for you and and help yourself heal, right, in whatever way that you need it, and know that there's no one telling you that you need to be perfect. There's no need to be performative in any kind of way. We're flawed humans, and that's just how it is. And this is what we have to work with. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your story and just having this conversation with me, it means a lot.
Well, and again, thank you for creating the space for me to tell the story. It is therapeutic for me, so it surely means a lot. And I think if there's, I'm just trying to think if there's anything I could add. And I think just giving people ideas. The Body Keeps the Score was a pivotal book for me, and I think it can be for everybody. I've probably in the last 3 years read maybe 20 books on directly related to therapy and trauma, and more in particular. Out of those books, I'm not sure I would always recommend The Body Keeps the Score to be the first book to read. So if somebody is not familiar with trauma, they want to dive into it and understand it more. To me, the best book and the most approachable book is a book called What Happened to You by Bruce Johnson and Oprah Winfrey. I think it came out 2021, so it's a fairly new book. I think that that's the most approachable and engaging book. It's like The Body Keeps the Score is pretty thick. What Happened to You is just not as thick, and it's in my mind, a great place to start.
I will add in your contact information in the show notes. So anyone listening wants to reach out to you, hopefully that's okay because I'm going to do it anyway. And you have some books that you've written that I can see behind you. So if you're watching the YouTube version of this, they will see that the whole time. But we'll put those links in the show notes for everyone to check out more about what you do. Probably now more connected to your personal journey than before. And did any of those books come out during this journey?
Yes. So my most recent book, The Elevated Leader, and the subtitle is "Level Up Your Leadership Through Vertical Development." This process of healing our mind and our body is a unique form of development that, in the psychological and space, and I'm trying to bring it into the business world space, it's called vertical development, and it's different than our typical developmental processes. And so the whole book is about introducing this concept of vertical development, which is a focus on elevating our being as opposed to just improving our doings.
We will share that in the show notes so they can check that out. I'll have all those links there. If you are listening to this episode now and you're enjoying what you're hearing, please 5-star rating and any kind of review would be lovely on Apple Podcasts. And until next week, we will see you. Have a good one. For more information, please visit www.thelifeshiftpodcast.com.